I guess this is appropriate, right? Making update videos on Shane Wright because, you know, as a guy that covers Montreal prospects, every time we see something good happen in the Montreal prospect world, we talk about it. It was like that with Caulfield. We're starting to do that now with other guys in the system, Joshua, Riley Kidney, etc. But like, Shane Wright, while not being a Canadiens prospect, is pretty much a Canadiens prospect at this point, isn't he? I don't really think the Canadiens are going to go off the board, trade the pick, or use it on somebody else, right? So let's go over Shane Wright, because the guy just wrapped up his 2022 OHL playoffs. We're likely not going to see him in action until the August World Juniors, unless the Canadiens, after the draft, decide they don't want him to go, but we don't really have any reason to believe they're going to do that. So for now, let's just go with the assumption that we're going to see Shane Wright next at the World Juniors. But for now, he just got eliminated, playing for the Kingston Frontenacs in the OHL playoffs against the North Bay Battalion in the second round. Guess what? The team ended up losing the series in 5 games played. The last game was yesterday. It was a 6-5 loss, and Shane Wright had himself a goal. In fact, if you go over to the point production in total, it might seem a little bit daunting to see that he only had 14 points in 11 games played, especially that 3 goals for rating. But there are some reasons for that. We can talk about why he produced a whole lot more points in the regular season. He had 94 points in 63 games in the OHL, and only the limited sample he had in the postseason. But let's go over what he did yesterday in the 6-5 North Bay win. He scored himself a goal in the third period. The North Bay Battalion had a 5-2 lead, so really not great for the Kingston Frontenacs, but Shane Wright, with 10 minutes left in the third, takes the puck on the right face-off circle. He comes in and he absolutely wires it. It goes in, it's 5-3. Eventually there are a few more goals scored. The ending score is 6-5 North Bay. But this goal was the last point for Shane Wright in the OHL. Most likely. All things considered, I don't really think that Shane Wright is not going to make the NHL right away, so this could probably safely be said as his last OHL point. And it's another one of these examples of Shane Wright just absolutely wiring a puck from anywhere. We saw this at the U18s a few years ago, where he and Bedard were absolutely tearing things up. Shane Wright can just snipe it from anywhere, and his wrist shot is so lethal that this is a guy that could legitimately go out there and have 40-goal, 45-goal potential in the National Hockey League. He's so smart, he's so defensively sound. Sure, he might not be Patrice Bergeron level, but good enough to the point that he is in that top center category. I think he's definitely able to do that. And his defensive chops were really what carried him throughout this postseason run, in the first round against the Oshawa Generals and then in the second round against North Bay. This comment on Reddit kind of goes out there and explains it pretty well. Here is his final stat line: 11 games, 3 goals, 11 assists, 14 points. His coach was using Wright as the go-to defensive guy. Defensive zone faceoffs, PK, etc. With how bad his team is defensively, Shane Wright is forced to take on the brunt of defensive responsibility, while they have other older guys who can score a lot who get more offensive roles. I hope the Habs let him go to the World Juniors in August. And so there is somewhat of an explanation as to why Shane Wright didn't absolutely light the world on fire in the OHL playoffs. You take a look at some of the other guys that have come through this draft in the process. Mitch Marner, of course, had a really good playoffs in 2016, with Tkachuk and Dvorak, that's what it was. You had Connor McDavid in 2014-15, who absolutely torched the playoffs alive with Dylan Strome. There are a whole bunch of guys that do well, usually in these circumstances. Shane Wright, even though he was defensively relied upon, unfortunately did not exhibit the same point production as some of those other players, but it's all circumstantial at the end of the day. I think the Canadiens are still going to be getting a good player regardless. A guy that could come into the NHL and maybe get, let's say, 15, 20 goals and maybe 15, 20 assists. Like, I don't want to make my expectations too high for the guy, of course, because he is still just an 18-year-old guy who's going to be suiting up in the NHL, but realistically, I mean, you go back to the previous CHL guys who have made their NHL debuts right away. Nathan McKinnon, Nail Yakupov, Steven Stamkos, Tavares. These guys usually produce pretty well in their first years, so I think it would be a little short-sighted to say, oh, Shane Wright only had a point per game in the OHL playoffs, he's not going to produce all too much in the NHL. But then it also would be sort of foolish to ignore the history books that OHL talents do usually do well. And it's part of the reason why I don't think the Canadiens are going to send the guy down either. We talked about this in a previous video, or was it the stream? I'm not really too sure. But some people were asking, hey, Shane Wright did not produce like Connor McDavid did. He did not produce like some of the other first overall exceptional status guys did. Heck, even going back to 2020, Shane Wright's production was not as good as Marco Rossi's or Cole Perfetti's or Alexis Lafreniere's in the queue. Because the numbers were not that great, do you send Shane Wright back to the OHL for 2022-2023? And my immediate answer was no, because firstly, you go back to the past 20 years worth of NHL drafts, the only two guys that didn't go to the NHL right away, Owen Power, Eric Johnson, both defensemen, both NCAA products. You take a look at the OHL forwards that had gone first overall, and they always make the league right away. If Shane Wright does not do that, firstly, I'd be very surprised, but secondly, he would be breaking a trend that has consisted over the past few decades at the very least, and you take a look at how the Canadiens could handle that situation, I don't really think it's something they would want to prepare for because, you know, the media backlash and the fan base sentiment would be sort of uncontrollable should they actually send Shane Wright down to the OHL after being drafted first overall. And besides, Shane Wright himself said he'd like to play for Montreal, he's okay with the city, he likes the fans, etc., etc. It seems like the guy is built for the pressure that being a Montreal Canadien could provide, so I'm not really all too worried in that respect. It's just whether or not he pans out, that's a different story. Alexis Lafreniere had a whole bunch of growing pains because the speed of the NHL just didn't match the queue. You could still see that he's a smart guy, he makes a lot of really good decisions, and he finds guys well, which are traits that he exhibited in the queue that really did help him push his draft stock. And Shane Wright sort of has those same things going for him, where he's really carried by his smarts. Sure, his wrist shot is fantastic, his playmaking, his skills fantastic, but it's ultimately the profile of what goes between his ears and behind his eyes that carries him forward. It's little chip plays, it's little spatial awareness plays that really set Shane Wright apart from other players in the draft. And the difference here is OHL defending is such a different animal compared to NHL defending. NHL defending is a lot tougher. There's a lot less space. The guys are all faster. So it's a question as to whether or not Shane Wright's smarts will be good enough to carry him into a new environment where everybody is just so much better than what he's been facing off against in the OHL. I don't doubt Shane Wright will be able to produce points because his wrist shot is so good, plus the fact that he is another option to play on the power play alongside of Cole Caulfield. Having two right side snipers would be fantastic, but it's just the defense and the consistency, right? I don't really agree with some of the other assessments that say that Shane Wright is going to be Bergeron, because Bergeron is one of the best defensive forwards the NHL has ever seen. The guy's always in the Selke conversation, the guy's always winning the Selke, so to say Shane Wright is going to be in that same mold, I don't really think so. I think he's got a lot more of an offensive side to his game than Bergeron does. However, it is nice to see that the Kingston Frontenacs are taking strides into saying, okay, Shane, you're going to focus on defense this playoffs. We know you can score. That's not the problem here. The problem is that the rest of the team isn't really all too great, so you're going to be getting the number one responsibility into shutting other teams down. And it worked against Oshawa, to be fair. So, talk in the comments all your thoughts about Shane Wright and what he could be for the Montreal Canadiens. I'm making this video as if it's a Canadiens prospect update because, let's face it, it pretty much is. The guy is going to go first overall and the Canadiens are going to use that pick. I mean, if Jeff Merrick's hypothetical trade proposal of trading down to third does come true, then okay, I'll eat my words, but the Canadiens getting another first-round pick next year from Arizona would be fantastic. But either way, let me know your thoughts in the comment section about Shane Wright, his development as a defensively minded forward, his offensive skills, the way he came alive in the postseason, not on the score sheet, but in terms of the defensive responsibility. Do you see a lot more out of him than I do at the NHL level when it comes to his two-way ability? Or are you kind of more in the conservative range like I am? I've been saying this entire time that Shane Wright could be like a Jonathan Toews in the NHL, probably maxes out as like 90 points on a season, but not really the best defensive forward out there. However, there still is a lot to look forward to, and the guy's only 17, 18 years old, right? So there still are more years to come of him developing and becoming better. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Hope you enjoyed this video. And bye.